Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 43. Shattered Again. Kevin glanced into the back seat of his car, a frown on his face. Jen was curled up there, wrapped in a bright purple blanket. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her breathing was wheezy. Gwen was watching her cousin like a hawk. It had been 2 days since Ethan left for Mount Rushmore, and Jen's cold had gotten bad. But they couldn't exactly take her to a doctor with her altered DNA. Azimuth had advised against it, anyway, while she was out on her week-long expedition around the universe with him and Paradox. So Kevin was using an old family recipe. If this cold got any worse, Gwen would be telling Grandpa Max. He had a cold cure that had worked on the Omnitrix user before, and would likely do so again. Jen wanted to avoid that, though, as it was nasty beyond belief. So they pulled up to the only open Mr. Smoothies in the area this late, a rest stop style just a few miles outside of town. Kevin ordered her regular and pulled a small flask out of his glove box. Jen frowned. I still don't see how this is your old family cure. It's a smoothie. Kevin shook his head and poured some liquid from the flask into the smoothie.
That's not the cure. It's just what's most likely to help you in particular keep it down. It's bitterroot. My mom put it in ice cream for me.
Gwen smiled slightly. Kevin still hadn't gotten back to his mother. But he'd pointed her house out to Gwen from the car. He was too insecure right now with his current appearance to go see her. But it was nice to hear him talk about the good bits of childhood as Jen sucked down the smoothie, her fingers pinching her nose as she did to try and block what sense of taste she had left. Gwen had made herself a promise that once Kevin was cured, she would drag him by the collar to his mother's house. Jen pulled back from the straw, her face pinched, and Gwen held out a tissue. Her cousin snatched it up and sneezed hard. It sounded like a miniature explosion. Kevin snorted. Gwen glared.
What? She's tiny. You'd expect her to have one of those dainty sneezes. She sort of sounds like a car backfiring.
Jen glared. Slightly glazed green eyes, still fiery as she blew her nose into a second tissue. Gwen held back her own snort of laughter. It was true that Jen was the shortest of the group. She was all of 5 feet tall, set against Kevin's near 6-foot form and Gwen's 5'5". Even Ethan was taller than her at 5'3". But she didn't like feeling smaller than the others. But before she could complain about it, a bright light filled the parking lot. Kevin looked up and frowned.
We got company.
Jen glared out her window and frowned. She left the car as Gwen began to protest. I know that ship. She snuffled before she closed the door. Gwen frowned as she looked out her own window. She blinked. No way! She hopped out of the car, too. She knew the ship currently landing just outside the parking lot, too. Though the last time she'd seen it, they'd been waving goodbye to its pilot, safe in the knowledge that the creator of the Omnitrix wasn't going to let the universe blow up, and even trusted Jen with the device. Kevin frowned.
You know that ship?
Kevin asked, looking a little tense. Usually when the Tennysons recognized a ship, it meant it was about to start firing on them. But Jen was smiling. That's Tetrax's ship, Jen said before coughing into her sleeve. Kevin frowned.
The bounty hunter you made friends with when you were a kid?
Jen nodded as the gangplank lowered from the back of the ship. Jen sniffled and held out a hand to Gwen, who handed her cousin another tissue. A large figure in a gray spacesuit stepped out of the ship, the black helmet retracting to reveal the face of a Petrosapien. Gwen smiled as Jen stepped forward. It's good to see you. But Tetrax didn't look happy at all. Instead, there was a frantic glint in his yellow eyes. Jen frowned, but Tetrax was faster than her right now. He grabbed her and yanked the Omnitrix to him as she cried out in pain, his stone grip far too tight on her arm. Jen Tennyson, give me Chromastone! He spun the dial on the Omnitrix. Wait, she cried out, a second too late as he slapped down the dial, selecting Chromastone. Green lights flashed, and Diamond Head stood where Jen had been mere seconds before. Tetrax frowned. You're not Chromastone. Jen shook her head, trying to pull her arm free.
Yeah, no, if you would let me talk,
But she sniffled and sneezed, sending shards of tadenite flying. Gwen had to throw up a shield against them, Kevin diving behind her. Tetrax seemed unusually impatient. I sense Chromastone within you. His eyes narrowed in contemplation, and a wall of solid tadenite sprouted from the ground around them, hiding them from view. If Tetrax had been acting normal, Gwen wouldn't have been worried, but the ex-bounty hunter had never acted like this around Jen. Exasperated, sure, but never like this. She conjured steps, and she and Kevin raced up them as the screaming started. Gwen ran faster. Tetrax was pressing a large gun to Jen's torso, and Diamond Head was shattering into pieces that fell away, revealing Chromastone. As the pieces of her cousin tumbled to the ground, Gwen blasted Tetrax back away from her cousin. As the form they hadn't seen since it was shattered by Vilgax shook its head. Something didn't seem right, though. This Chromastone was more red than pink. The normally green cyclopic eye was white. Jen? Chromastone shook its head.
Not Jen.
They're right. Diamond Head's voice echoed from the still intact head on the ground as Gwen's stomach turned sour. But Tetrax didn't seem to notice that he'd just shattered someone who considered him a friend and mentor. Instead, he held a red crystal out to Chromastone, who nodded. It is time? They asked, and Tetrax nodded. Chromastone nodded back, and Tetrax stabbed Chromastone in the torso with the crystal, which absorbed into the dark stone there. Then Chromastone took off, flying up and out of the atmosphere. Diamond Head looked up after it. I did not know Chromastone could do that. Tetrax nodded, kneeling to gather up the shards that were Jen.
They can do far more than that.
Before he could do more than set the pieces of Jen down by her currently disembodied head, Gwen had him trapped in mana bindings. She glared as Kevin looked over Jen.
Shit, he did a number on you. Gwen, help me get all of the pieces of your cousin together.
Gwen used her mana to help Kevin gather what they could of Jen's shattered tadenite. Kevin placed the Omnitrix symbol where he guessed her torso would be. Gwen frowned. Are we sure this is even going to work? Gwen had seen her cousin with the injuries her aliens sported before, and it wasn't pretty. She didn't even want to picture the pile of gore that might result from this. Kevin frowned, clearly thinking along the same lines.
We don't really have a choice. The Omnitrix is going to time out eventually.
Gwen closed her eyes as Kevin slapped the Omnitrix. Green lights flashed, and Gwen peeked through her narrowed eyelids. Jen was sitting fully formed on the pavement. There didn't appear to be a scratch on her. She sneezed a few times and groaned, flopping backward onto the pavement. How does a silicon-based life form even get a cold? She grumbled, her voice still stuffed from her stopped-up nose. Tetrax shrugged. I've never had one. I fear that malady may be something only you experience. Jen glared at him from her spot on the ground. Gwen turned her attention to the ex-bounty hunter, too. What do you want to do with him? She asked her cousin as Kevin helped her to her feet. Jen looked him over. Let him go so he can explain himself. Tetrax nodded and did just that, telling them the tale of the single shot his world had to be reborn, and its people along with it. Then, of course, Vilgax attacked, demanding the return of his crystal, but Kevin and his big mouth let slip where the crystal was being taken. Vilgax flew off, and they followed close behind in Tetrax's ship. Recreating a species was something Jen Tennyson could now say she had done 25 times. She was exhausted, but the energy she'd channeled as Diamond Head, somehow miraculously unshattered, seemed to have cured her cold, for which she was grateful. It also seemed that she could once again use Chromastone, as now both crystalline aliens appeared on the Omnitrix, instead of constantly selecting Chromastone and getting Diamond Head instead. She grinned as they loaded back onto the ship. The Petrosapiens were already rebuilding their cities and towns as the ship took off. Jen sat down and smiled to herself. It was a good feeling, knowing that she had helped that happen. Tetrax reached over and laid a hand on her shoulder.
My people owe you a debt that can never be repaid.
Jen shook her head. Your people don't owe me anything. They have every right to life, just like everyone else. I'm just glad I could help. Tetrax smiled.
And that is what makes you a hero. It is good to see you again, Jen Tennyson.
She smiled too. It's good to see you too, although maybe next time we can forego the shattering and just hug instead. Tetrax laughed. Jen joined him after a moment, but when they landed, all laughter died. Max was waiting for them with a few plumbers she knew had been stationed at Mount Rushmore. Jen frowned. Grandpa, what's going on? Max Tennyson took a deep breath.
Something's happened, Jen.
Chapter 44. Bad News Bears. Cadet Armstrong, Cadet Wheels, front and center. The voice called across the training room. Helen and Manny raced forward to the front of the classroom where Magister Patellidae was waiting. They frowned. He had Alan and Cooper with him, too. He shook his head as they tried to ask what was happening. He took them all into a room they'd never been in before. It was plush, with a long couch, a very comfortable room. It was sort of unnerving them more. Sit down, please, cadets. They all sat, sharing the couch. Helen bounced her leg until it blurred. Manny was fiddling with his mechanical hand. Cooper was picking at a fingernail. Alan leaned forward.
Magister, what is this about?
The Pisceus Valance sighed and sat down in the armchair across from them. One of the things you'll have to do in your line of work as plumbers is deliver bad news, like the kind I have for you today. Jen frowned at her grandfather. What happened? He took a deep breath.
Kiddo, you should really sit down.
She shook her head. I'd prefer to stand. What happened? He shook his head.
There's been an accident.
Jen's eyes went wide. Max continued.
Victor and Ethan were out on a supply run in Keystone. There was a car crash. A trucker fell asleep at the wheel. He swerved into oncoming traffic.
Jen had gone as pale as Ghost Freak. No. She shook her head and twirled the dial on the Omnitrix. In a flash of green, Accelerate was racing off down the road faster than Gwen had ever seen her move. Max closed his eyes, tears spilling from the corners. Gwen shook her head as Kevin pulled her close. Kevin found his voice first.
Did they make it?
It is my sad duty today to inform you of the death of one of your team members. The whole Max force was quiet. Helen had gone so still she didn't seem to be breathing. Patellidae looked up at them. Ethan Validus and his father were in an automobile accident while on a supply run in Keystone, South Dakota. Helen shook her head, and the others sat stunned. Cooper leaned forward.
When?
The blonde asked, his voice shocked.
About an hour ago.
He and his father were out in Keystone, getting basic supplies for the human plumbers stationed at Mount Rushmore until the permanent base in Bellwood is finished. A large truck veered into their car going the other way. They were both killed on impact, along with the driver. Manny shook his head as Helen grabbed hold of his nearest hand. Her voice cracked as she spoke up. Did the others? No? Magister Patellidae frowned. Jen 10 and her team were off planet at the time of the accident. Magister Tennyson has assured me that he'll be the one to tell them. Jen skidded to a halt near the flashing lights and sirens. She'd run all the way from Bellwood to Keystone, and the Omnitrix flashed red and timed out, leaving her running at her own speed down the street. She refused to believe it. It couldn't be true. She shoved through the crowd until she reached the site of the accident. There were 3 covered figures laying on the ground. She shook her head and made to race forward, but was caught around the waist by one of the officers. A familiar voice spoke in her ear.
You can't help him, Jen.
It was Pierce, wearing an ID mask, to appear as one of the officers. If Jen was thinking clearly, she would realize that the other police now at the scene were likely disguised plumbers too. But she wasn't thinking clearly. Her eyes were fixed on the smallest of the covered forms. She stamped down hard on Pierce's foot and brought her elbow back into his sternum. He reeled back, releasing her, and she raced forward, skidding to a halt and dropping to her knees by the covered form. She yanked back the sheet that covered him. If it wasn't for the blood, he might have been sleeping. His eyes were closed, and he looked peaceful, but he wasn't breathing, and there was so much blood. She reeled backwards, staring down at his face. She didn't even notice Pierce pulling her back to her feet and ushering her away as one of the other police officers recovered the body. She was stunned. She didn't speak as she was loaded into the back of one of the ambulances. She barely noticed the two bodies loaded into the back as Pierce sat down next to her and carefully tucked a bright green blanket around her. All she could see was Ethan's blood-covered face. The ambulance set off, no sirens ringing out. Maybe that was why no one noticed when it changed halfway through town into an unmarked truck. It made its way out to the hidden base in Mount Rushmore, and Pierce took off his mask. He bundled Jen out of the truck as several medical staff met them. "She's in shock." His voice sounded like he was underwater to Jen, or maybe she was the one drowning. She certainly felt like it. There was a tightness in her throat she couldn't place or explain. She didn't really hear the medics say that her grandfather and cousin were already waiting for her in the med bay. She didn't even feel the tears spilling down her face.